The French Revolution and Napoleon. The French monarchy in crisis. Under the old regime, the king, at this point, was Louis XVI, basically. The king ruled with absolute power and preserved the rigid social structure, or the social class system in France. The people were divided into three estates, or three social classes in France at this time. The first two estates were nobles, who made up what was called the second estate, and clergymen, or Roman Catholics, and they made up the first estate. And they enjoyed many privileges and didn't pay any taxes. They made up about 2 to 3% of the overall population, the first and second estate did, of France. The third estate were the commoners, which was the majority of the people. So about 97 to 98% of France's population belonged to the third estate. And they paid all the taxes. They had a very heavy tax burden. These were made up of city workers and peasants, and they were also made up of a new middle class in France known as the bourgeoisie, and that is spelled B-O-U-R-G-E-O-S-I-E, bourgeoisie. And in fact, there was a song a few years back that talked about someone being bougie, and that is a slang for meaning middle class, fancy, a fancy dresser. So it's kind of an interesting term, but bourgeoisie was the upper middle class. These would be your business owners and your wealthy merchants. Now at this time in the 1770s, problems started facing the monarch. In the 1770s, France was heavily in debt due to foreign wars they were participating in and in the maintenance of Versailles. Economic expansion had begun to slow because trade was being hindered by outdated regulations and rules from the Middle Ages. So they were still operating under a system from, the 1300s when it came to their economy, yet it was now the 1770s. As the situation grew worse, Louis was forced to call the Estates General, which would be like our Congress. And this was an assembly of the three estates, the three social classes in France. And it had not been called, it had not met for 175 years. So what happened under the Estates General and the Constitution of France at the time, in order for the king to raise taxes or to drastically change things, they needed to call the Estates General into session and get it approved. But the king had been able to rule France without doing this for 175 years. The revolution begins. The Estates General met in 1789. Representatives of the Third Estate, along with some reform-minded nobles and clergy, clashed with the king. They finally had an opportunity to meet. They wanted to make some changes. The king didn't really want to make any changes. The Estates General did take a peaceful step toward revolution, a peaceful revolution, when they set up a new government known as the National Assembly, and they agreed to write a constitution, a very clear constitution. Then the storming of the Bastille would occur on July 14th, 1789. Social unrest in Paris led to the storming of the Bastille, which was a prison that Parisians saw as a symbol of the old regime, or the old way of doing things. It triggered further uprisings and convinced the new government, the National Assembly, to move swiftly. So the Bastille is basically where all political prisoners were held, so it was a very controversial place. It was a very ugly prison. Some of the reforms that by August the National Assembly had adopted were: it abolished feudal customs and serfdom. It ended tax-exempt privileges of the nobles. Some people really didn't like that because now they were going to have to pay taxes. It adopted the Declaration of Rights of the Rights of Man, which listed the democratic principles that later became the basis for the French government. It passed the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, which gave the French government control of the Catholic Church. So these were all some pretty radical reforms for the time period, but these were things that people really wanted in France. Louis XVI was forced to move from Versailles to Paris, and he reluctantly accepted these changes. So one of the reasons why they made Louis and his wife, Marie Antoinette, move from the palace at Versailles is they felt like the king and queen were way too removed from the common people of France and that they were not seeing the suffering of their people. So they wanted them to be in Paris where they could hold them more accountable for governing. 1791, France had its first written constitution, making it a limited monarchy with a system of separated powers. So before, when I said the Estates General hadn't met for 175 years and it was required, it wasn't like a true formal constitution. It wasn't, it was just kind of the rules of how things were done. And there were some decrees that made that the situation. But here, now in 1791, France would have its first written constitution. And it made it a limited monarchy with a system of separation of powers, much like Montesquieu described. However, few people were happy with the new government, and many nobles opposed the changes, like paying taxes, while radicals demanded a republic rather than a monarchy. They wanted the monarchy completely gone. The divisions within the country deepened when Louis XVI and his family tried to flee France in 1791. They actually tried to escape, fearing for their safety, and were caught trying to flee, which didn't help their popularity in France either, because they were seen as trying to abandon their country in its time of need. The revolution deepens. Revolutionary ideas spread from France to other parts of Europe. European monarchs prepared to invade France and restore Louis XVI to power, because other European monarchs were concerned if the French monarchy was overthrown, that might give their people ideas about overthrowing them. Also, many revolutionary leaders in France wanted war because they thought it would unite the people in defense of their homeland. France declared war on Austria in April of 1792. At first, France did badly. The National Convention, a new government, took power in France. So the National Assembly is already overthrown, and a new government called the National Convention takes power. It was more radical than the people in general. So the really radical members of the French society take over and form this new government. It abolished the monarchy, so the king is gone. France was made a republic, and it tried and executed Louis XVI. This is probably the most controversial thing that occurred under the National Convention. News of the king's death brought Great Britain, Spain, and the Netherlands into the war against France. Many of them were very concerned with the execution of the king. They felt it was unlawful. The National Convention appointed a committee of public safety headed by Maximilien Robespierre to meet new threats. So the Committee of Public Safety was formed by the National Convention. This was an even further, a group of even stronger radicals. Robespierre was known as an extremist, and basically they were put in charge of any new threat that came against France. That committee was supposed to come up with the policy to deal with it. Robespierre's response was he unleashed a reign of terror which lasted from July 1793 to July 1794, a year, to suppress dissent at home and to beat back foreign invaders. During it, thousands of French men, women, and children were condemned to death. Basically, anyone who was thought to disagree with the radicals' ideas was convicted as a threat to the Republic and condemned to death. So a lot of blood flowed during the Reign of Terror, and that's how it got the name Reign of Terror. During its first 4 years, it faced many issues and threats, or perceived threats. France began to win some battles, and the people of France got disgusted with the constant executions. In July of 1794, Robespierre himself was finally tried and executed. He took it so far that eventually they realized that he was the biggest threat to the Republic. A new government then, the Directory, came into power. So they had the National Assembly that was then taken over by the National Convention. Then after Robespierre is executed, a new government known as the Directory is put into place. During its first 4 years, the Directory, it faced many problems with government corruption and inefficiency and rising food prices. Napoleon Bonaparte in 1799, with the help of his troops, overthrew the Directory and had himself named First Consul. And that is C-O-N-S-U-L, First Consul. So you have this new Directory trying to establish some control. It's facing problems with inefficiencies, rising food prices, and corruption. And then this famous military leader, Napoleon Bonaparte, uses his troops to basically overthrow this government and establish his own rule. And he appoints himself First Consul. By 1799, the French Revolution had abolished the monarchy and feudalism, and French society had become more democratic. Napoleon in triumph and defeat. Between 1799 and 1804, Napoleon centralized power into his own hands and proclaimed himself Emperor of the French. The majority of French voters approved this action. Although Napoleon ruled with absolute power, he preserved many reforms of the Revolution. He issued the famous Napoleonic Code, which brought together many of the reforms into a single unified legal system. Under it, all men were equal before the law, and it protected freedom of religion. So you can see some crossover between the American Revolution and the French Revolution in this area. And the Napoleonic Code has a great impact on modern legal systems. He also made economic reforms to strengthen the French economy. Napoleon used war to create an empire that extended from Spain in the west to Russia in the east. French soldiers helped spread the revolutionary ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity, or brotherhood, to the peoples of Europe. So as they conquered areas, they spread these ideas of the Republic with them. Napoleon's conquests nurtured the idea of nationalism among the conquered peoples. As nationalist feelings grew, revolts against the French rule broke out across Europe. In 1812, Napoleon undertook a disastrous invasion of Russia that left his forces greatly reduced. As a result, Napoleon was forced into exile, and Louis XVIII, brother of the Louis XVI, was restored to the French throne. This completes the section on the French Revolution and Napoleon. Please come prepared to class with any questions that you have about this lecture. Thank you.